Good morning. My name is Mike Dukakis. I was the former governor of Massachusetts. I'm the chairman of the Boston Global Forum. And I want to say thank you to all of you for joining us in another of these fascinating, interesting, we hope very productive online international conferences. I want to thank in particular two old friends, Joe Nye and Ezra Vogel. Both of whom know a great deal about this subject and joining us and will be participating actively with us. John Quelch, who many of you recall moderated our first international conference on the subject of occupational safety and health standards internationally, will be doing his usual fine job moderating things. And to all of you both here in Cambridge and across the globe who have participated with us. As you know, the Boston Global Forum has been designed to focus on particular issues of great importance internationally. One of those is occupational safety and health standards. Today we're going to begin a series of 3 conferences on China, Japan, and the United States, and more broadly the world, and how we deal with this set of issues. I don't have to tell any of you that this is an area of great and growing importance, always has been. That there are problems involving claims to islands, territorial claims, and a variety of things which are causing a fair amount of conflict. And one of the things we want to do today and in the future is focus on this and see if there are ways to resolve those issues. And so for that reason, we've invited you all to be part of this. We look forward to it. We're going to have a good, lively discussion for the next hour and a half, but we intend to continue this work and return to this forum at least 2 more times in the course of the year, and then see if we can't be a constructive part of the debate and dialogue which seeks to resolve these kinds of issues and does so peacefully and effectively. Having said that, welcome again, and I want to turn the proceedings over to Professor John Quelch from Harvard Business School, and he's going to moderate our discussion.
All right, thank you very much, Governor, and good morning to all of you around the world, in Tokyo, in London, and in China and beyond. And we have a really excellent treat for you this morning, because not only do we have Professor Joe Nye of soft power fame and former dean of the Kennedy School of Government here at Harvard with us, but as a special bonus for all of you who got up so early or are staying up so late wherever you are, we have Professor Ezra Vogel, who is the distinguished Harvard professor and definitive biographer of Deng Xiaoping. And what we're going to do is to start off our discussion with 10 or so minutes of introductory comments from Professor Vogel. And then we may slip in a question or two, and then we will do 10 minutes of introductory comments from Professor Joe Nye, and we will then proceed with the discussion thereafter. So very proud and honored to be able to introduce now Professor Ezra Vogel. I'm not sure how many copies of that wonderful biography you have sold of Deng Xiaoping, but I'm sure it's more than the number of people who read it from one end to the other. It's a very, very heavy book, but a wonderful, wonderful, thorough appreciation of a great 20th century Chinese leader.
Well, the quick answer is 50,000 through Harvard and 720,000 through Beijing. So far, it's only out 1 year in China, but it was the bestseller by a foreign author last year.
All right.
What I thought would be most useful in the way Joe and I have decided to divide up the duties is that I would talk about the China relation with Japan, and then Joe would come in and bring it in with the United States. And I think the simplest way to provide the context for all this is to trace the quick history from the time when China and Japan normalized relations in 1972 until the present day. In 1972, you remember Nixon had gone to China, and the Japanese were afraid that we were going to get ahead of the China market, and they wanted to move very quickly, and they did. And so Tanaka went to China And within a few days of meetings, he normalized relations very quickly without resolving all the ordinary problems that resolve in normalized relations. So relations could not really very well develop. But then when Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978, he realized that in order to really develop, they needed cooperation not only from Europe and the rest of the world, but the two main places he needed help from were the United States and Japan. And so he decided to work hard to finish the normalization process with the United States and to upgrade the relationship with Japan. They signed a treaty of peace and friendship, which meant they could then move ahead to all kinds of trade and exchange issues on a much broader scale. And in October 1978, just 2 months before the famous third Tenon that launched reform and opening, he went to Japan. In the 2,500 years of contact between China and Japan, this is the first time a Chinese leader went to Japan. It was the first time in history that a Chinese leader met the emperor. And Deng Xiaoping felt that he had to have a broader base for relationships than just the pragmatic business relationship. He wanted the business relationships. He knew he needed investment. He visited while he was there the Nissan plant, which had just introduced robots. He introduced the Matsushita, which would be able to help build TV sets and modern electronics in China. He visited the Kimitsu steel plant, which had the model steel plant that became the model for Baoshan, the first modern steel plant in China. He visited those plants. He took the first ride on the fast train. Now China has more miles, but at that time, it was the first time that Chinese leaders had ridden on those. Something Mike Dukakis appreciated, somebody who has worked on transportation, tried without success to modernize American transportation. But he succeeded in laying that basis, and he insisted that China not only introduced the technology, but introduced novels, that they introduced literature. They introduced TV programs, introduced TV serials, including everyday serials. People who were educated in the 80s in China had a chance to see real movies. And when he met the emperor, he expressed satisfaction that the emperor had rejected the path of World War II. And just as within domestic issues, just after the Cultural Revolution, then he says, don't argue, get on with the future. He said, and that's what he said about international issues also. That you don't just argue, you get down and think about the future. In 1980, when they did a public opinion poll in Japan, do you have a favorable opinion of China or not? The Japanese had a 78% favorable image. Now it's 90% unfavorable. What happened? Of course, 1989 was a big blow around the world. The Chinese lost popularity around the world, and they lost it in Japan also. But from 1989 to 92, Japan played a very special role in China, because as China was trying to break through the sanctions that were imposed by all the outside countries, the country most willing to help them out was Japan. So they pulled their punches on Japan. But after 1992, the situation had changed quite dramatically, and Japan began to be the object of targets of Chinese denunciations. I think if you look at the broad changes that occurred, of course, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, so it was no longer important for Japan to be united with China and the United States in the Cold War. Also, after the Tiananmen incident, the Chinese leaders were worried about the public support for the leadership of the Communist Party, and they started an education program to teach greater patriotism to the people. And when they started that campaign, the thing, of course, that was most successful in creating a patriotic mood was World War II, what the Japanese did in World War II. And there was a history to that, because in World War II, the Chinese communists had made patriotism, anti-Japaneseness among the most central parts of their program to build support. And therefore, the propaganda department began showing all kinds of movies of World War II, replaying, like we used to show American Indians, Taboo Indians when Mike and I were kids. That was just all over everywhere. It was in the school, and the Japanese did not have history right, and museums began to be built. And so the population that was being trained in the 90s had a very different attitude. Also, I think there were international issues. China was worried about Taiwan becoming too independent, and that was the time the independence movement was beginning to rise. And because the Japanese had such close relations with Taiwanese ever since 1895, that was a real worry. And so part of the anti-Japanese movement was to try to separate it off. Well, that gave the basis for the growing anti-Japanese mood. By the early 2000s, they began to quarrel over Japan and China began to quarrel over all kinds of issues. It had come to head in 1998 when Jiang Zemin visited Japan, and the Japanese Prime Minister said that he would not stop visiting Yasukuni Shrine. It was popular, of course, for Japan to say that they're not going to be pushed around by China. So the situation we have now is where China has begun to feel stronger. They feel that they have a military, their economy has passed Japan, and they feel they can push harder and be more successful. The Senkakus happen to be the current focus, but I think the only way to understand the issue is in the broader context of the relationship and the history between the two countries. Chinese attempting to build patriotism. And we have now a situation, as you know, where there are constant little battles of airplanes and ships near the Senkakus, or Diaoyudao, as the Chinese call it. Those problems are very intense. We have Chinese leaders refusing to meet the Japanese and misunderstandings. The Chinese have been winning the propaganda war because instead of focusing world attention on the pressure on the Senkakus, they have focused attention on the Japanese who privatized, who nationalized the islands, who bought the islands. They have focused on history, it is at the Yasukuni Shrine, and the Japanese have been vulnerable because they to that kind of international publicity, because they've not done enough to give international publicity to what they really believe, and that is that they did wrong in World War II, and domestically they're quite clear about that, but the international publicity is a problem. Right now, I think there is a hope for a little bit of improvement, and the hope is from Hu Deping visiting. Hu Yaobang was the man in the 1980s, #2 in China, who was in charge of youth exchange. And he had many youth exchanges with China. And one of the things he was criticized for when he fell in 1987 was inviting 3,000 Japanese youth. He had a very good relationship with Nakasone. He has his eldest son, Hu Deping, has just visited Japan. And it happened that Hu Deping, who just visited Japan, was a close childhood, not childhood, at least a youth friend of Xi Jinping. And this is a clear signal that Hu Deping, going there, seeing the leaders that the Chinese are willing to consider, and that goes right to the top. I had it just happened that I met Hu Deping for 4 hours in January. And he's not knowledgeable on the Japanese issue in detail. He's not somebody who can play the role of the detailed foreign relations expert. But he has the context and the political position and the family connections that he can play a big role. So there is a slight chance that by the APEC meeting this fall, if things are handled well, and I also understand from someone who saw Abe last week, that Abe himself is much more confident that he has stood up to the Chinese last year. He proved himself that he's a tough guy, and that he's really ready to be quite pragmatic if you can find a way. So that's the broad context of the scientific.
Okay, thanks very much, Ezra. May I just offer one quick follow-up question, and that is, to what extent do you feel that there is pressure on the leadership in China from behind the scenes, from the military wing, if you like, of the party, to engage more intensely in these actions in the South China Sea and beyond?
There are a lot of things we don't know about the military, and we're all guessing. But I think the best information we have is that, yes, there are some people in the military who feel they haven't fought a war, and that ever since 1894, when they lost to the Japanese, that's been absolutely humiliated, and they're now strong enough. And we do see statements coming from certain military leaders published in their own publications that suggest that they're ready to take on the Japanese and make it win. And so I think there's no question that some people in the military have that view, and it's therefore the responsibility of the top political leaders to keep that under control. I think there was a danger in the latter days of Hu Jintao that it was almost getting out of control, and that he did finally bring it under control. But I think the dominant view now is that with the Obama visit with Xi Jinping, finally the military in the United States and China begin to talk to each other and to begin to get that under some kind of control.
Well, thank you. Let's turn now to Professor Joe Nye, if we may, to look at the perspective of the relationship between Japan and the U.S.
Thank you, John. I must say I have to congratulate the Boston Global Forum for its timing. The idea that we would have this session at the same moment that President Obama is in Japan reaffirming the U.S.-Japan alliance is extremely interesting timing. Basically, the Obama administration's policy, which originally was called a pivot toward Asia, but it was rechristened a rebalancing toward Asia, reflects the fact that the United States wasted the first decade of the 21st century mired in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, at the time that Asia was the dominant part of the world economy, dominant in the sense of most rapidly growing part of the world economy. And I think Obama came into office with a strong commitment to re-establishing the U.S. presence in Asia. In fact, he sent Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State to Asia for the first trip by Secretary of State, which was unprecedented. So he's had an interest in Asia for some time, but the original term, pivot, was a bit of a misnomer, which is why I think they quickly got away from it, because you can't suddenly pivot away from the Middle East to Europe, as we're seeing today with Syria or Ukraine, but it doesn't mean that you aren't, for a long-term strategy, placing more emphasis on the position of Asia. In fact, if you go back to the Clinton administration in the early 90s, much of the outline of the current American policy toward China and Japan was done at that time. At that stage, there were people who were in the United States who were noticing the dramatic rise in the power of China because of the growth of the Chinese economy. And there were some who argued that the United States should try to contain China before it was too late. That was never a viable policy for two reasons. One is it would have been virtually impossible to have organized an alliance of countries to contain China. Most other countries in East Asia want a reasonable relationship between the United States and China, and China and Japan. So they weren't about to form a new Southeast Asia Treaty Organization or East Asia Treaty Organization or anything of that sort. But the other reason that it didn't make sense as a strategy to try to contain China was that if you opted for containment, it meant you were opting to treat China as an enemy. And if you treated China as an enemy, you were guaranteed to get an enemy. Whereas if you held open the question that China could be integrated into the international system, you might have a reasonable relationship with China. And I think that bet was a good bet. It's also true, however, that while we wanted to integrate China into the international system, we also realized that nobody knew how China would behave, including Chinese leaders, and as it became more powerful, and that it would make good sense to reaffirm the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty as an insurance policy for the United States and for Japan. And that's essentially what happened. So that in 1996, Clinton and then Prime Minister Hashimoto issued a declaration in Tokyo which said that the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty was the basis for stability in post-Cold War East Asia. Before that, some people in both countries, in the U.S. and Japan, had said, well, the Security Treaty was a relic of the past, it was a relic of the Cold War, which had let it die, so forth. Our feeling was that at the time, when I and Ezra worked together on this in the Clinton administration, our feeling was that keeping the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty was a wise insurance policy, so that the approach or the policy overall that the U.S. took toward China and Japan was one that you might summarize as integrate but hedge, or integrate but have an insurance policy. So we opened the hand to China to join the international system, most particularly the World Trade Organization, which the U.S. helped to sponsor Chinese membership. And at the same time, we kept the insurance policy for the U.S. and Japan in case something went wrong. And that policy, I think, has actually worked relatively well. I remember sitting at a summit between President Clinton and then President Jiang Zemin, in which, it must have been 95, in which Jiang Zemin leaned across the table and asked Clinton, do you want a strong China or a weak China? And Clinton said, we have more to fear from a weak China than from a strong China. And the reason that we could say that was because, A, we believed it, but B, because with the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty reaffirmed, we were in a position to actually have a policy of opening to China, but ensuring against something going wrong. That was continued, that policy was continued in the Bush administration. Bob Zoellick, who was then the Deputy Secretary of State, coined the phrase responsible stakeholder, that the United States was inviting China to become a responsible stakeholder, which is another way of saying that we acknowledged or recognized the growth of Chinese power and welcomed it. And in that sense, I think Obama, his policy of rebalancing toward Asia, the framework had already been set by this work in the Clinton administration and in the Bush administration. Or as I used to sometimes say, to summarize how we saw the optimal relationship, a triangle of good relations between the United States and China, the United States and Japan, and China and Japan, was the basis for stability in the region, and that stability would produce more prosperity. Here you have the first, second, and third largest economies in the world, treating Europe as separate countries rather than a single entity, but in terms of national economies, if they were able to have stable political relations and growing economic relations, that would be good for China, good for Japan, good for the U.S., and good for the world. So that was the framework of the American policy. Now, what could go wrong? Well, one of the things that could go wrong is there are certain actors in the region, I think of North Korea in particular, which are totally unpredictable. We have no idea how the drama in North Korea is going to turn out. We do know that they often take high risks, for example, the sinking of the Cheonan, and that these risks may get out of hand. So one possibility is something goes wrong in North Korea. All the more reason why having a strong alliance between the U.S. and Japan, the U.S. and South Korea is important there. And those are points that Obama is touching on this trip. The other thing that can go wrong is something, some miscalculation that would occur in an atmosphere of rising nationalism in both countries. As Ezra described, the use of patriotism, nationalism for political support inside China. I think we're seeing some of this returning inside Japan, though nowhere near the ways in which it's been exaggerated. Japan is not becoming a nationalistic, militaristic country, as propaganda puts it, but there is, on the right wing of the LDP, the kinds of pressures which led to the visit to the Azerbaijan and so forth. And the danger is that some event will occur in that climate in which it will be difficult for political leaders to maintain the situation because of domestic opinion. In 2012, after the latest dispute between China and Japan over the Senkaku Diaoyu Island issue, Hillary Clinton asked me and 3 other former government officials to go to Tokyo and Beijing and to call on the prime ministers of the 2 countries. And I came back from that convinced that neither country at the top wanted a conflict. I mean, there was pretty clear consensus on that. But the danger is something that would start from the bottom up. Some miscalculation that, as it escalated in a climate of nationalism, would be difficult for top leaders to control. That is the scenario that the North Korean scenario worries me most. There's sort of miscalculation of something happening in the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands is the one that worries me next. And Kevin Rudd, who's here, the former Prime Minister of Australia, and I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post on Sunday, as it was published, in which he said the best way to handle the issue of the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands is to go back to the wisdom that Ezra cited of Zhou Enlai and Tanaka. And what Zhou Enlai and Tanaka said is, let's put this off for future generations. Trying to resolve the sovereignty issue at this point is not going to work. So rather than deal with that sovereignty issue, let's do something which takes the issue off the table while leaving the question undetermined for another generation. And one of the things we proposed was having treating these Senkakus as a maritime reserve, which would be no habitation, no military use, and it could be a way of taking the issue off the front burner of the stove, where it might boil over and spoil the other dishes, and pushing it to the back of the stove, where it might simmer for another generation or so. But whether that's the answer or other answers, I think the important thing is that the basic framework that the U.S. has in its rebalancing toward Asia is not containment of China. Is to try to create this stable triangle of relations between U.S., China, and Japan, and make sure that that triangle remains stable. We're going to have to use a bit more imagination of how we deal with the unpredicted or unpredictable, such as events in North Korea or miscalculation in the Senkaku diagram.
Joe, thanks very much. I want to turn to Prime Minister Rudd in a moment, but if I can just insert a couple of very short questions for you. Has Washington been surprised, indeed not just Washington, but Brussels and Tokyo as well, by the speed with which China has come on in the last 20 years? So when Clinton said we prefer a strong China to a weak China, well, yes, but not that strong a China. So that's question number one. And question number two, has Washington come to terms with and appreciate how to deal with a second-time Prime Minister of Japan, who perhaps has taken us and the world by surprise, perhaps not, in terms of the forwardness of his stance on security matters for Japan?
Well, on China, yes, China's done better than expected, particularly after the 2008 financial crisis, where you had growth in the range of 10% or more. But back when Ezra and I were toying with this issue of trying to project the future of China in the early 90s, we were projecting 7 and 8% growth. So in that sense, yes, China's done better, but it's not as though we were expecting China growing at 3 or 4%, which suddenly became 10. It was in the ballpark, or in the range that we expected at the time. On Japan and Abe's package of positions on defense, actually these are quite reasonable positions, which the Americans have supported. And what I've said a number of times is, I have no objection. I don't think most of my friends in the administration have objection to the substance of Abe's defense package. It's the fact that he wrapped them up in an old 1930s newspaper. It's like being given a gift, which is not a bad gift, but with ugly wrapping paper. And I think that's been counterproductive from the point of view of Japan's own objectives. So I don't think that it's not the substance so much of what he's trying to do. It's this appealing to nationalism and going back to history. Things like threatening to revoke the Tono Statement or the Moriyama Statement, which were apologies for terrible things that happened in the 1930s and 40s. They should never raise this.
And what is your sense of the U.S.-Japan treaty obligation with respect to how far the U.S. should go or is required to go?
Well, I think it's interesting that President Obama yesterday reaffirmed the fact that Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty covers the islands. And the American position on this has been, when we handed back Okinawa in 1972, we handed back administrative control of the islands to Japan. And whatever position one might take about events in the 19th century, which go back to the original question of who did what to whom in terms of sovereignty, since 1972 it has been crystal clear that what we had administrative control of these islands, we handed them back to Japan as part of Okinawa. Therefore, they're covered by the treaty. And the Secretary of Defense has said that, the Secretary of State has said it, the President has said it. And I think it's important that there be no ambiguity about that, so that there's no danger of a miscalculation. So I think I agree with what Obama did yesterday in reaffirming that statement.
All right, let's turn to Prime Minister Rudd. The benefit here is that Australia is a neighbor in the region, and therefore has, I think, a perspective on this trilateral relationship we're discussing here that is particularly helpful for us at this stage of the conversation.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to those who originated the Boston Global Forum. I assumed that this was planned well in advance to coincide precisely with their visit. I pay my respect to the forward vision and personal capacity of those who organised the forum. A couple of points about how we've got to where we've got to on China-Japan, where it is now, and some thoughts about the future. Ezra's insights are quite profound, in the sense that Sankoku Gyari-Dao is a modern manifestation of an ancient problem. The problem with this modern manifestation is that it's potentially a very dangerous manifestation. And the reason for that is not because either Beijing or Tokyo wish to use armed force to resolve this problem finally and formally, because both sides appreciate how toxic that could be for each other. It is, as Joe just pointed out, the sheer phenomenon of crisis management, which we all know from history, can go in any which way, in any direction, where rational man ultimately subsumes direction to sub-rational passions, otherwise called the body politic within the respective countries, and internal perceptions of where leadership dynamics lie within Beijing or political dynamics lie within the LDP. Therefore, of all the recent things that we have seen in China-Japan relations, this one worries me the most for the last 20 years. And I've been around at the dance floor on China-Japan and China-Japan-US for the better part of the last 30 years, and seen most of the manifestations of it one way or the other, either as a diplomat or as a politician or as a prime minister or as a foreign minister. The second point about history is the deep toxicity of anti-Japanese sentiment within China itself. I was serving in Beijing at the time when Hu Yaobang issued the invitation to 3,000 Japanese students. I remember wandering out to Beijing Airport, to actually the old airport, not the old airport, but the old airport, not the newest old airport or the newest airport. I think we all know, if you've been to Beijing, which one I'm referring to. And just, I sat there in the embassy car, our embassy car, and just watched these 3,000 kids come off the plane and then all walk to their buses as you could, because there wasn't a whole lot of things happening at Beijing Airport in those days. And I was with my Chinese driver at the time. He said, this is going to go very badly. And I said, what do you mean? I said, this is a great step forward. I mean, we are bound, this forward-leaning, comes directly out of the Deng Xiaoping normalization visit. Tanaka in '72, he said, well, we think this is, to use his term at the time, table friendly. This is just over the top and too much. But it got outside the pace of what they anticipated to be the normalization curve with Japan. And the rest is history in terms of Hu Yaobang, although that was just one element of the reasons which brought him down. That brings us into the present, and to reinforce again Ezra's sage observation about the recent visit of Hu Yaobang's oldest son, Hu Deping, to Beijing. Nothing in China, no, let me correct that, most things in China are not an accident. Something's done. Hu Deping's visit is certainly not an accident. And it's worthwhile thinking through why that has been made possible at this stage, and received reasonably well at the Japanese end as well. I think there are two reasons. One is tactical and the other is somewhat strategic. The tactical reason, of course, is the upcoming hosting the APEC summit in China, where, because the heads of the APEC economies represent economies and not countries, technically, the Chinese have no alternative but to ensure that Abe is invited and welcomed, and etc. Remember, Taiwan is a member of APEC, Hong Kong is a member of APEC, etc. So whether the Chinese like it or not, we have an Abe prime ministerial visit rolling down the railway tracks toward you. And this can go either one way, either two directions, spectacularly bad or manageable. and so therefore, the Chinese find themselves in an immediate tactical diplomatic need to manage tensions down at a tactical level. For me, that is less significant than what I think has been the more recent strategic calculation by Chinese leaders. And I cannot speak for Japanese leaders because I have no direct source of information. But I assume similar logic prevails, but I don't know so. And that is, our friends in Beijing, including the military you referred to before, I think have done some pretty basic analysis of the scenarios which would unfold from conflict by miscalculation in the East China Sea. And most of those scenarios are pretty bad at multiple levels. Number one is a Chinese fear that they would perceive the international community as an aggressor, simply because of perceptions of relative size and, frankly, the way in which China has positioned this issue over time. That's an active Chinese perception that they would suffer considerably in global international opinion. Number two is that they have, I think, a genuine concern that if there is a limited conflict in East China Sea, that China would not necessarily comprehensively prevail. Japanese naval capacity is not insignificant. If you're managing an engagement between the two, leaving outside the American alliance obligation, then frankly, you have a real problem on your hands if it's not a clean lay-down-misère win from Beijing's perspective. And I think this is called the strategic realism within the PLA in particular to say this is not necessarily trending in the right direction if we have you know, the 2014 equivalent of a Sarajevo type phenomenon on the high seas, and all the diplomatic communication and signaling and wrong signaling gets out of control, and we escalate into an incident. I think the third strategic reason, though, why the likes of Xi Jinping are concerned to see this managed down over time is that this, frankly, is bad for business. It is bad for the core economic program, which is the first priority in Deng Xiaoping's policy priority list. We all know that the successful transformation of the growth model lies at the absolute center of Chinese priorities at present, because they know the existing growth model is running out of time. The new growth model is a massive transformation exercise. If there were to be an outbreak of major strategic instability in East Asia, that undermines the trajectory of the economy, which dovetails to Joe's point about what makes him most anxious at night, which is the North Korean scenario, which makes us all most anxious at night, because it is a known unknown, and it's a really bad known unknown, to paraphrase a recent leader in this country. But given that the controllability of the activities of Pyongyang are at best limited, the Chinese, I think, are seeking to de-risk their strategic environment to some extent because of their fear of where this would lead in terms of the viability of their long-term economic growth trajectory. Mind you, for the same reasons, you have seen, I think, in the last 12 months, the most significant moves by a new Chinese leadership, or any Chinese leadership, in reducing, frankly, the warmth of their relationship with Pyongyang through a series of actions which have been read loudly and clearly in Pyongyang, I think, although we don't know what precise long-term effect that would have, but it's simply a manifestation of the same logic. So, where to from here? The devil's dilemma is this, and this is, again, I go back to the great opening remarks from Ezra about the fact that not only we have this historic toxicity in China and Japan going back several centuries and several thousand years for a multiplicity of reasons, which are cultural and civilizational and in part racial, but also the most horrific history that we saw in terms of the brutality of the Japanese occupation of China. And Japan, in its current circumstances and its future capacity to deal with this, makes it infinitely more complex because of decisions to go to Yakasuni and continued controversy over Japanese school textbooks in terms of the absolute objective phenomenology of the brutality of the Japanese occupation during the Second World War. It is not subject to historical dispute. It is a fact. And the best thing our friends in Tokyo can do to deal with the complexities we now face at a strategic level is, in fact, to deal with that comprehensively and not permanently to resurrect that ghost from the past. Someone as wise and as sagacious as Deng Xiaoping, for whom I have enormous respect, knew that if you took the genie out of that bowl, you never know where it's going to land. And hence his conversation with Tanaka back then, and the use of the Zhongrun, which is, let's not actually have a debate about the past. If it's going to take us in horrible directions, let's only focus on the future. And my final point, therefore, in the midst of this in terms of the devil's dilemma is that nationalism, that patriotism is a potent and dangerous box for either side of this relationship to draw upon in terms of dealing with domestic, political, or broader problems. And we know that in history and other contexts. In this case, it's particularly dangerous. Every time I go to Beijing, which is usually about every 6 weeks, I flick on the TV news, and what I see within the first bracket at the top of the news is item 1, 2, or 3 is some other rendition of some historical Japanese atrocity somewhere, often in battlefield I've never heard of, and I'm a reasonably keen student of the period. And so this easy fallback to deal with major national political and policy challenges or international political challenges, which is to dip into the box of I would call it cheap patriotism on either side of the equation, has all sorts of, I think, potentially very disastrous consequences for both sides. And I think for China in particular.
What, if I may, Prime Minister, what can those of us who are not Chinese or Japanese do in the face of those boxes, which are very country-specific and very culture-specific?
I think in terms of the historical and civilizational factors, the more we say to our friends in Tokyo, just get square with history, the better, frankly. And I know it's uncomfortable for our Japanese friends, but it's the truth. As someone who's been in and out of China for 35 years, frankly, as soon as this is put to bed, the better for everybody. That's the first point. But the second one is this: for the future. Joe and I, as realist observers of all this, know that this Santoku Garuda thing is unfixable. It is just inherently unfixable. And the smart people since '72, even if they kind of forgot at the margins of the normalisation discussions back then, smart people then and now realise it's still unfixable and will be forever, probably. Therefore, the mission in life, without any elegant diplomatic phraseology around it all, is for friends and partners of Japan and China to accommodate this in a way which parks the problem, puts it on the back burner, and leaves it there. And the diplomacy lies in the simple transition mechanism from taking it from front page to back page, never quite into the comic section, but front page to back page, where Deng Xiaoping and the smart people of the early 70s knew it should always be in the first place.
I think at this point I'd like to turn to former ambassador to Japan, David Warren, who is in London, and particularly in light of Prime Minister Rudd's comments as someone who's had 2 tours of duty in Tokyo during your distinguished diplomatic career. How do you see the deep cultural issues, Japan vis-a-vis China, that Professor Vogel and Prime Minister Rudd alluded to?
Well, John, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to join the webinar today. Can I correct you? I had 3 tours of duty in Tokyo. My first tour of duty began the week that Deng Xiaoping in Tokyo in 1978. So I remember those doors opening very fast. And the cultural issues you refer to are very complex and difficult. And I want to start by agreeing strongly with what Prime Minister Rudd said about the importance of sending a message to our Japanese friends that they should not seek to revisit history in the way that some of the extreme nationalists within the LDP and intermittently Prime Minister Abe in some of his statements appear to want to do. But I do want to set this in a context of Japanese perceptions of Chinese intentions. I was very struck when I was ambassador between 2008 and 2012, during a period, most of which we had the previous opposition Democratic Party of Japan in power, and how strong a consensus there was across the political spectrum that China was a proximate threat to Japan's sphere of influence, and that Japan stood directly in the way of China's intention to challenge the hegemony of the United States in the Asia-Pacific region. And I went to countless presentations, and not just by nationalist politicians, by internationalist politicians, doves as well as hawks, which seemed to accept this premise as underpinning the vulnerability of Japan in this context. Now, from an outside perspective, it seems to me that the Chinese have 3 key strategic objectives at the moment. One is to demonstrate that Japan does not control its own territory. Secondly, if they can, to drive a wedge between Japan and the United States in terms of their overall relationship. And thirdly, again, if they can, to ensure that Japan, so to speak, fires the first shot, or at least it appears to be the provocateur in the relationship. And those who have spoken so far are absolutely right to say that every time the Japanese politicians or the Japanese government go atavistically into their historical analysis and seek to revisit their recent history, they play directly into Chinese hands. It's very striking, I think, that Abe has a high degree of popularity, and that is because he is injecting a much greater degree of momentum into the Japanese economy. Some of that popularity, I think, does stem from a sympathy for his nationalism, but I believe that the center of political gravity in Japan is still more centrist than nationalist. It was striking during the recent election for the Tokyo Metropolitan Government that the extreme nationalist candidate, the former chief of the air staff, Tamagami, came fourth. Those of us who were watching these elections closely were concerned that he came a less bad fourth than we should have liked, but nonetheless the center of gravity of that local election was very much centrist. And I believe that there is still a strong desire among Japanese people to get the balance right between maintaining the pacifism which underpins the Constitution, however much it is reinterpreted as proactive pacifism, and maintaining a sense of national pride which does not extend to becoming excessively provocative towards Japan's neighbors, not all of whom, of course, necessarily share the Chinese world view. It is very frustrating, however, that it seems to be so difficult for Japan to maintain the intellectual front foot in this discussion. The Murayama Apology of 1995, which was the apology for Japanese war crimes endorsed by the then Murayama government, is a very powerful statement. It makes explicitly clear that Japan not only behaved wrongly and that its foreign policy was wrong, but that its rule in Asia was colonialist and that its military was aggressive. That statement has been endorsed by every Japanese government since 1995, including the present nationalist Abe administration. So it is frustrating that it remains difficult for Japan to to take the initiative in a way that enables them to get beyond what I would describe, to be judgmental, as mischievous Chinese accusations, that in some way the Senkaku, the Ayutai argument represents a Japanese desire to visit the war. I'm always an optimist as a diplomat, and I only have to think back 6 years to a Japan-China relationship that was much more open and positive, indeed strategic and beneficial in the terms of the formal language, at the time of the last Abe administration and during Prime Minister Fukuda, and even Prime Minister Aso, although Aso himself came with a very strong tradition of Japanese nationalism. So it is possible to craft a pragmatic relationship that can work. But those who have so expertly introduced this discussion today are absolutely right to say that the relationship has deteriorated to its worst degree over the last 40 years, and that it is necessary as a first step to ensure that whatever else Japan does, it does not retreat into this atavistic nationalism and give China more ammunition in its propaganda war. And I find it very hard to escape a realist analysis, which is that in the absence of the effective groundwork for a proper pragmatic relationship between Japan and China, it is the United States that has to demonstrate the effectiveness and the force of its alliance, as clearly as President Obama did in his public statements yesterday in Tokyo, to the effect that the Senkakus were clearly covered by the security treaty and that America would honor its obligations under the security treaty. In the longer term, we have to work for a multilateral environment and framework within Asia that enables us to contribute to a resolution of these disputes, many of which are not even acknowledged as disputes by the major protagonists. And there is quite a lot of thinking that has gone on among foreign policy experts on what the different layers of that multilateral framework might be. But at the moment, we have a very classic struggle between two powers on their red lines and no multilateral framework within which to set that fundamental disagreement. And that is why it is so important that the United States sends unequivocal messages, which is what I read President Obama as having done during his visit to Japan at the moment.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think, given your comments, it's a perfect time to move to Tokyo. And in Tokyo, we have a number of distinguished faculty members and guests, including Professor Sonoda of the University of Tokyo and Professor Dairo Kono. Gentlemen in Tokyo, what questions or comments, briefly, would you have on the discussion so far?
My name is Chris. Well, good morning, Boston. My name is Kosuke Daiono from the Meiji University. But then I agree with one argument of the ambassador very much. Actually, if you we have to be calm down and look at the reality between the two nations. Actually, China has become the largest trade partner ever since 2012. That's one. Number two, there are more than 22,000 Japanese companies operating in China, hiring almost 10 million Chinese people directly or indirectly. Then Japan is the second largest direct investor in China, and both Japan and China are rapidly aging society. So we really have to worry about the future, how to finance the pensions in the future. By the 2030, actually, number of the people over 65 in China will be 300 million people. So we have to really worry about that. If we fail to meet those problems, that will lead to instability of Chinese society domestically. That's not the good thing to do. Well, I really feel that it is not the time to flirting with the nationalistic sentiments, but to work on those problems we share. So we have to build up that trust among the between the two countries. So we have to come up with a way to build up the mutual trust in one way or another. Maybe exchanging more scholars, more economic leaders between two countries. When I was in Beijing in December last year, well, I talked with many professors over there and Beijing University, Peking University. They are very objective. They know they have to do. They worry about the problem in the future. So there are many rules to talk about. The thing is that, well, actually, those people in the diplomatic corps do not have a chance to talk to any one of those, professors, even the president of the Peking University. Well, but actually, we organized. Well, that's really interesting. But we organized a kind of anime exhibit by the university. Then more than 2,000 students came over to watch, and then some of them actually sing title songs of anime movies in unison, in perfect Japanese. They don't care about what Senkaku Island province. So we have to set the environment to talk about the common issues. That's the most important things. And one more comment. I'll be talking too much. Well, the ambassador mentioned about the gubernatorial race in Tokyo, right? Actually, the ultra nationalistic candidate came forth. But if you really analyze the result of the election, actually, well, he got the most votes from the young people, right? But they are not really, they do not want to change status quo too much. They worried about the, jobs, the futures. So that's a really domestic, reaction. Well, they just cannot find any good politicians replacing him, right? So that's what I think about the discussion so far. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Can we just hear briefly, please, from Professor Sonoda and Professor Hekisai, if you have any further comments?
Right. Basically, My name is Sonoda, and I totally agree with my colleague's idea. But because when I was asked to say something about the U.S. role to make the Sino-Japan relations much better, I thought that I originally thought that the U.S. can exert their distance between U.S. and China-Japan as cutting edge or compatible advantage to make China-Japan relations much better. I'm really curious how you regard yourself. You have the idea about the U.S. role to make the Japan-China better. That's the only question that I have right now.
May I ask, did you have the same reaction to President Obama's comments in Tokyo as the ambassador had, in terms of a strong reaffirmation of past commitments, or are you skeptical?
It's yes, in a short time it's good, but in a long time it's not good, I think. So,
Can you just say why?
why?
What leaves you skeptical?
Because such comments might evoke some discussions within China, in Chinese argument, which makes a relation a little bit difficult to manage.
So, excuse me.
Go ahead.
Excuse me.
Yes, go ahead.
Because I can't speak English well, I will speak by Japanese. Excuse me.
I will translate. I am the interpreter, Shinya. I will be translating Mr. Sekihei's words into English.
実は私がもともと中国の出身でありまして、今は日本国籍に帰化して日本で活動しています。
I am originally from China, but I turned into Japanese before, and I'm living in Japan, doing activities in Japan.
ここでね、我々は日本とアメリカと中国、この3カ国の関係を討論するときにね、やっぱり一つ大事なことが忘れてはいけないのは、やっぱりその中で3カ国の中で唯一中国だけがやっぱり意図独裁の体制が違うという国家でありまして、価値観が全然違います。
When we discuss about the relationship between Japan, US, and China, one thing that we have to remember is that only China has a totally different political system, which is that China is a totalitarian regime.
ということは、例えば習近平、中国の指導者が彼たち国際問題を考えるときにね、彼たちの念頭にあるのはむしろ怒りして自分たちの体制を守る。それが彼たちにとっての、一番基本的な問題でありまして。
So when the Chinese political leaders think about these international relations, what they have in mind is actually how to maintain their regime.
それでマオタクド時代が彼たちが共産主義のイデロギーで国民を束ねてきて、要するに統治を、共産党の統治を正当化してきました。マオタクド時代、マオゼドン時代。
In the Mao Zedong's period, Mao Zedong's era, the main ideology was the idea of communism. That was what pulled people together.
しかし、鄧小平の時代になってから、共産主義のイデロギーが、完全に崩壊しました。
But then in the Deng Xiaoping's period, this ideology of communism, it just collapsed.
そうしますと、今の共産党がじゃあどういうふうにして自分たちの統治を正当化するかとなりますと、結果的に愛国主義、ナショナリズムということを持って、政権を正当化するしかないという状況になっているという話です。
So turning back to the current Chinese Communist Party, what they can rely on is this notion of nationalism and patriotism.
Can I stop you right there? Because what I'd like to do is, I think Dr. Sekihei represents a very important sentiment within Japan. I'd like to just ask Professor Vogel, who I'm sure is familiar with this point of view, looking forward, what would you say to Dr. Sekihei as approaches that we in the West or he in Japan can take towards breaking this gridlock of nationalism?
Well, I agree with Prime Minister Rudd that the Japanese can do more to package what they feel about World War II, actually. And I think particularly the young people in Japan do not know enough about the details. So when a young person from Japan goes to China and doesn't know anything about the Nanking incident, he's in trouble. And I think, therefore, you need an overall, something like a textbook, which is widely read in Japan, widely publicized. It gives an objective account of World War II. There have been lots of accounts of World War II, but we need something that's general, systematic, that can be understood by Japanese, and that can then be shown to people of other countries. I think, in fact, China underestimates how much the Japanese are rejecting World War II. And the peculiar thing is that as Jay Niles pointed out, when the Chinese say that they want to have a more peaceful Japan, and they push Japan, they're pushing it in the direction they don't want it to become. And I think that it's not only Japan that has some things to do. I think it's what the Chinese have to do is to give a more objective account also. And I think there needs to be more reflection in the Western press of acknowledgement of how serious the patriotism, how one-sided it is in China. One thing I've tried to do is bring together people from Japan, scholars from Japan, China, and the West, to study what happened in World War II. And I think that we have made some breakthroughs now among scholars studying that period in the three countries, so they can talk to each other in quite a professional way. It took 15 years to do that, but I think we've made progress.
Well, I think the first of our professors in Japan made two very important points. One on cultural and educational exchange, especially among young people, as a vehicle to move the needle. And also he highlighted the economic interaction between China and Japan and the importance of economic growth for each country to deal with the aging population environment that they both face. So I want to go at this point to Andrew Caney. Andrew Caney, formerly of Booz Allen, and now of the Fung Global Institute. Andrew, you've got some, I think, pretty good experience there in China. I'm not sure, are you in Shanghai today?
I'm actually in Seoul, the other economy.
You can talk to us a little bit about the trade and investment interlock between the two countries, which may act as a very important vehicle for ensuring stability here. How do you see it?
Yes, I mean, as several of us have touched on, there's a very large and interconnected economic relationship back here, going back to the open door policy with Deng Xiaoping. And if we look back from 95 onwards, actually Japan got around half of its export growth from the exports to China in that period. It's still a very large export market for Japan, but Japanese businesses have become somewhat frustrated with the political dynamics in the market over the past 18 months, couple of years, and so that very big presence remains. There's still $9 billion a year of foreign direct investment going into China from Japan, but they're starting to look elsewhere as well, down into ASEAN and balance things out. So from the Japanese side, there'd be a great desire to get greater growth into that relationship in support of the Abe restructuring and redynamism of the Japanese economy. And really there's a very similar dynamic on the Chinese side. So the Japanese have played a very helpful role in the industrialization previously. What is interesting to observe is Japan has for a long time been the main source of imports, about $130 billion or so going into China from Japan. Just this year, Korea is now overtaking Japan as Japanese growth of imports into China has leveled off, and Korea's kept on growing. Now, a lot of that is pure economics around similarity in the industrial base, the exchange rates, and so on, but there's also no doubt a political aspect to that. But the Chinese very much would want to keep the strength of this trade relationship because a lot of these imports then come in and play important roles within the re-exports, and that's just as true for the multinationals operating in China as it is for the Chinese enterprises. We saw with the Fukushima disaster the tremendous interconnectivity in supply chains, and so you can take one piece of the electronic components out of Japan, doesn't make its way into China for some reasons or some disputes. That has a lot of knock-on effects. It has a lot of knock-on effects around China's reputation as a place to do business, has a lot of knock-on effects around China's ability to develop its own enterprises, its own export base, all of which, as Prime Minister Rudd said, takes away from what Xi Jinping is trying to do in the transformation of the Chinese economy. So really, both of these countries have a very strong and interdependent economic relationship. There are some clear signs of some faltering in the past year or two, but also both sides have great interest in trying to get this on the right track again.
Thank you. Let me, if I may, just open it up to some of our other guests here in Cambridge. In particular, we have with us Suzanne Open, who is professor of political science specializing in Chinese politics at Northeastern University. How do you see the situation looking at China and the political sphere? Do you see it similarly to Professor Nye, or are you slightly less optimistic?
Well, I think there's a lot that China can do to improve relations with Japan and vice versa. I think one of the things I'm struck by when I'm in China is that Chinese people, and college students especially, really don't know much about Japan at all. They don't know about Japan's special role in China's economic development since China opened up. The government doesn't tell the Chinese people how important a Japanese investment has been. And I think that one of the things that could be done is not only to let them know objectively about World War II, but even more important, to tell them just how important Japan has been in China's growth. I think one of the things they could have done, and should do now, Japan has put all this money into China in terms of investment, but also grants of aid. They should set up centers for Japanese studies at the major universities throughout China, such as they did here at Harvard at the Weishao Institute. These kinds of centers could train students and future, they could be a place where a Japan specialist could be developed, and there could be exchanges, many more exchanges. Very, very little, considering their next door neighbors. There's virtually no exchanges between Japan and China. A part of this is Japan's fault, because the Japanese don't really relish going abroad as much as the Chinese do, but much more could be done there. So a greater use of soft power overall. And I think finally that one of the big problems is the law of the sea. The problem is this 200 nautical miles in every direction exclusive economic zone. And if they could amend the law of the sea to insist on joint exploration when there are questions, I think it would go a great deal. I'm sorry?
Where the claims one person 200 miles could also overlap.
Overlapping, yes.
Yeah.
Exactly, and I think that a change in the law of the sea, of course, China is not even a member of it, but so that would be an important step forward. I will say that in today's paper, some people have brought up this question of unexpected escalation, unplanned disasters. We just apparently they have signed a code for unplanned encounters at sea. So there is a new code out there.
Well, let me go to Joe for a moment on two things. First of all, do you think that Japan, as the expert on soft power, do you think Japan is weaker at soft power projection internationally than China? That seems to be the consensus. And then secondly, with respect to Suzanne's Law of the Sea issue, I recall that I think it was 4 or 5 years ago a cooperation agreement was signed between China and Japan for undersea gas exploration, for example, which seemed to be a very hopeful sign. But again, recent events seem to have undermined those initiatives, which were going quite well a few years ago. Can they be revived?
In 2008, Japan and China had negotiations over a gas field which lay underneath their border, and they agreed in principle to joint exploration, but this arrangement fell victim to the rising tensions. So, and again, Kevin and I mentioned this in our op-ed on Sunday. So this is something that should definitely be revived. So I think Suzanne is right. On the question of soft power, it's interestingly, Japan actually does pretty well in soft power. China spends too much of its efforts on soft power working on governmental propaganda, which isn't as effective, let's say, as anime, which comes bubbling up from below. But the interesting puzzle for China and soft power is its soft power is better in places like Africa or Latin America, which are far away. The soft power in Southeast Asia is less. And one way to think of this is you can't use hard power in the form of ships to block off the Scarborough Reef from Philippine vessels and expect your soft power in Manila to increase. In fact, the two are inversely related. So as China uses its hard power to settle these disputes in the region, it undercuts its soft power. And China has got to develop some sort of framework where it can avoid this dilemma. I think they should go back to the 2002 agreement to create a code of conduct for settlement of disputes in the South China Sea with ASEAN countries, and make it multilateral, which the Chinese have never quite wanted. They'd like to have it bilateral. I think it's in China's interest to have a multilateral code of conduct.
Let's go to one of our other guests, Ambassador Bindernagel. Ambassador, you're coming to us today, I think, from. Are you in Europe today?
No, I'm actually in Chicago today, but.
Okay, the Europe from Boston's point of view, that's as close as Europe. So you're the former ambassador to Germany. So perhaps a European perspective, again, would be helpful on this whole issue. How do you think the Europeans would be looking at this situation and what the United States could potentially do to be helpful, if anything?
Well, I'm struck by the discussion here about nationalism. Obviously, with the invasion of Ukraine by Mr. Putin, nationalism has taken on a different point of view and has really risen again in the European discussion. If I flip back to my time as ambassador for Holocaust issues, the questions are really, there's this ghost of the past that we've talked about here, and as Professor Fogel has noted, there is a time to set things off the table and there's a time to put them on the table. I would argue, as Joe has said, with the issues that are out there today, it's very important that we put certain things, unresolved issues, aside and try to work, as we've heard in the conversation, on working together on various specific issues and the conduct of maritime affairs, on the law of the sea, resource development, energy. Those, I think, are very important in the immediate policy area. But I wouldn't put aside the issue of the historical and animosity and the resentments that are still out there. And I would put on the table a really very important element, and that is that we should pursue the idea that the use of force is not acceptable, that all parties agreed not to use the use of force, and it has a discussion at the beginning, and then turn to the question of the past. As Ezra Fogel noted, it's important that scholars have had some discussion, and to bring in that discussion from the European point of view, what we've done for the last 20 years as the United States, we've tried to bring the parties together, not in the political realm, but outside the political realm, to talk about the history and where the history is going. Even in the Eurozone crisis, you saw the Greeks portraying Chancellor Merkel as a Nazi. So these issues will not be set aside and forgotten, but they'll be used, as we've seen in the discussion between Japan and China, to stoke nationalism. And then from the Europeans' point of view, they're very concerned. So for a very interesting, as Xi's visit to Berlin a week ago, or 2 weeks ago now, the party asked to visit the memorial for the murdered Jews of Europe. The European government, that is Merkel's government, said no. They did not want to find themselves between Japan and China on the issue of history. So there's a sense that the history needs to be addressed, but it should be addressed at a lower level, or a level that allows the political level to work for mutual projects. And there are a lot of mutual projects to be done. Maritime endorsement, or law of the sea was mentioned. How do you manage those issues? How do you manage the issues of resources around the conflicts that are around the islands? So from the European point of view, they have thought that they had moved past nationalism. Putin has changed the rules. We're back into nationalism, ethnic nationalism, and use of force in Europe. That's a very disturbing point, and they look to Asia, they look at the conflict on these islands and say, we don't want any part of it because we know where it leads.
Thank you very much. Jill Doherty, a CNN correspondent for many years in Moscow and other parts of the world. How do you think Russia, as an Asian power that has not been mentioned so far in this meeting, how do they view the Japan-China-U.S. relationship?
Well, I think actually, if you want to look at what's happening right now, it might be my use might be the best to focus exactly on what the previous speaker was talking about, which is Ukraine. Just generally to answer your question, John, the Russians have been referring more and more to their relationship with China, not just energy, but an alliance in the wake of what has been happening in Ukraine. For example, they've made the point that sanctions will not work because we can do energy deals with China. Gas, oil, we can sell as much as possible. Really doesn't make any difference what the United States or Europe should do. That is their line. Whether that's correct is a big question, but that is what they're saying. But just in general, I think the fluke almost of what has happened in Ukraine and Crimea, the unexpected events there, have raised a number of issues. And I think one of them would be philosophical, or at least the logic that Putin is using for moving into Ukraine and also potentially over the border into the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine is this issue of secession, or areas, ethnic areas. His definition of what Russians are is upending understandings that we've had for a very long time. Now, it cuts a number of ways. I mean, essentially what he is saying is he has the right now, Russia has the right now, to define how they will act in the world. And, of course, he's saying that there are ethnic groups within Crimea and ethnic groups in the eastern parts of Ukraine which belong to a greater Russian ethnic identity, national, cultural, and ethnic identity, and that he has the right to protect them.
So are you saying that, you know, China somehow or other is going to take a lesson from Putin in this regard?
I don't think that they necessarily are, because of course it raises unpleasant issues, which we've been discussing, Elizabeth and I, and the point was made before. Taiwan, Tibet, areas of ethnic, you could mention even Hong Kong in a sense, but especially secession areas. So China has been relatively quiet. I mean, I think they have, as Elizabeth mentioned, they have indicated that they tend to support the United States and the West in the Ukraine conflict, but they have not overtly come out and been very supportive of that. Because I think it cuts two ways. They want the energy relationship, and they want with Russia, and they want the geopolitical relationship with the United States. And just two very other quick points. I do think that it has also, this conflict has also raised the question of whether the United States would pivot or turn its attention to Europe again, to the detriment of the focus on Asia. President Obama's being in Asia would tend to undercut that, but there is a certain, I think, fear that that might happen. And this idea of upsetting the rules, though, I do think is the most disturbing trend of all, that there is very little good development.
Thanks, Joe. David Adelman, World Policy Editor.
Yep. I have a slightly counterintuitive proposal which I would like to perspective. In our winter issue of World Policy Journal, we focus on China and India. And frankly, I tend to think that this is going to be, over the next century or so, this is going to be the principal friction between and conflict points that are going to be increasingly important between China and the outside world. I raise that for several reasons. First of all, the dynamics there are I think, very critical, and the underlying forces that really motivate a lot of what's going on in China right now. It's population and food, and both of these countries face relatively similar challenges, shall we say, a challenge that's somewhat different from the challenge facing Japan right now. And I think finding room for their people, food to feed themselves, for the Chinese and for the Indians, this is going to be a vital importance. Not to mention the natural resources that go beyond that, water, oil, natural gas, and so on. And this, of course, is some of the increasing frictions with China and Japan in the undersea resources. So, unfortunately, there's as little understanding between China and India as there is between China and Japan. A lot of this is historic. We don't have really the time to go into this. I'd like to. I want to raise a couple of other points, though, parallel points. First of all, Obama's trip through Asia. I'm a little concerned that it's kind of wrong-headed in a way. I think what the concern should be is whether he, in fact, by the nature of this trip, by circling China, is going to raise the paranoia in China over the future role of the United States in Asia. So that's one point I'd like to make. I'd also like to make a point that was raised by, or a challenge point that was raised by a couple of other of your previous speakers. First of all, the question about whether the military might conceivably fight Japan. I see it a little bit differently. I think the military in China would like to have the perception that they could win a war with Japan without necessarily actually going all out and doing that. Sure. And that's the principal reason, I believe, for their push through aircraft carriers, the Blue Water Navy, and so on. They want the perception out there of being able to project their power wherever they feel is necessary without actually going through the potential difficulties of doing that.
That's straight out of Sun Tzu.
Right, exactly. Precisely. Very well put. The second question is this issue of containment. I'm concerned about this question of counterproductive pressures on China being perceived as ganging up on them. And I'm concerned that this is a real fear for the future, and that's something that the United States particularly should guard against, and Japan as well. The final point, I think, is that if there's going to be a real condominium between China and Japan, I think it's going to come in terms of trade and economy. And I'd like to call the parallel between Taiwan and China. Taiwan and China right now, and the Chinese have told me this particularly, and the Taiwanese as well, they believe that the cross-China Formosa Straits trade, banking, and other issues, that's what's really bringing those two parts of the world together. And I think that if China and Japan equally can move in a similar fashion, that this can be very positive for the future.
Thanks,
Okay.
David. Let me think, because we're running out of time, quick comment from the other side of the table, and then we'll ask Ezra and...
Excuse me, I came from
Professor
So let me have 2 minutes.
So you go first, we'll then turn to you, and then Ezra and Joe will summarize, and then Mike will close the meeting. Please.
Thank you very much, John. I wanted to talk about U.S. policy toward China. And I think one of the key things is to avoid, as everyone around the table has said, some sort of arrangement that looks like containment. I think we want to avoid that. On the other hand, the United States is, as a single country, becoming weaker in world politics over time with the economic growth of China. So the United States still needs leverage, even if it isn't going to be containment style leverage. It needs good economic relationships with a whole series of other countries, and particularly TTIP in Europe. I think that's crucial. That adds another 17 or 18 trillion to the U.S. GDP. And if that huge amount of purchasing power and industrial know-how is brought together, it completely overwhelms China, at least in terms of technology and a whole range of other things. So I think one of the key things is to get leverage, which is not at the same time containment. And then in the end, you can bring the Chinese into this. You couldn't bring them in at the beginning, because that was tried already with Hu Jintao, and he said no. So what you want to do is get something that is so strong with the Europeans and the Japanese together with the United States that the Chinese can't afford not to join it. They would have to join.
Excellent point. So trade and investment being a key driver of collaboration here.
Right.
Okay, Professor Hamada, my apologies. Go ahead.
When I was appointed as a special advisor concerning economics, I told him my I told him my ideology is more hawkish, not less focused than his, but here, anyway, I appointed him. So he has various.
You told Abe that?
I told him I am more dovish. Okay. And also about the soft power mentioned, I think Professor Vogel to increase the articulation of Japanese students here. That means there is something missing as a part of the soft power of Japanese. They have the artistic feeling, anime, baseball. But I think in public discussions, I may not give you a great example, but they have problems. But I think Max Weber has a vocation as a politician, either to be a politician of conviction or politician of concern consequences. And I have to admit that President Abe's, particularly Yasukuni visit and so forth, emphasize too much of his conviction and not consequences. And I think he is learning slowly. And
do you think he's going to pull back from that? Do you think
I don't know.
He's made the point, as someone said earlier, he's made the point this year he can now move on?
Yes, I hope that.
Okay.
I talked with Jeff Regan in California last week, and he and I agreed that Abe may not be the last person to be instrumental in bridging China and Japan, because Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan all considered to be as a conservative, but they could, because of their credibility to other part of the constituencies, they could achieve. Let me finish my talk by, I was going to Washington sometime, and a Chinese young person, not student, he said, talked to me, what do you think of the present situation? So I parroted the same question to him. He said, look at the Diaoyu or Senkaku rocks and islands. They are just nothing. Why do we waste our energy discussing about that and forgetting about the ample possibility of population? In game theory, from non-zero sum to zero sum population is needed, I think. And how to achieve that is a politician's task and not my expertise of economics can help. And of course, because of ideology difference, and this is my personal opinion, nothing to do with Mr.
Yeah, I think that applies to everybody who's spoken here today. So we're out of time. I'm going to have to ask Joe and Ezra to make some closing comments and then turn over the government to Carter.
Well, as befits something titled a global forum, we've had a very rich discussion across several continents. But I think the thing to remember is that while we've raised a number of problems and heard some possible contributions towards solutions, if you have the largest, second largest, and third largest national economies in the world at odds with each other, you don't even have to hit a war before you have trouble. And so in that sense, I think it's in our interest to pursue many of these suggestions that we've heard this morning to see whether we can dampen down this crisis. I come back to the point that Kevin Drunt made, that we need to, from an American point of view, we need to try to stabilize that triangle of good relations among U.S., Japan, and China. And that means finding devices or ways to dampen down, if not solve, some of these potential threats to the stability of the triangle. Ezra?
I think it's been a wonderful discussion, and I basically agree with the comments that all the speakers have made. I would just emphasize how deep the contact already is between China and Japan. The local governors and party secretaries in China want to keep Japanese investment for their local area. When I was in Osaka recently, I was told that in the big plaza, shopping plaza, the second language after Japanese is Chinese. There are over 100,000 Chinese students in Japan, and I'm told the relationships are really quite good. There are huge Japanese business interests in China, as people pointed out. So I think that the trends of economics and social and cultural relations in the right direction, we need a lot more work for all of us. I think as academics, business leaders, political leaders, in trying to do what's really good for the region. And it's in our interest in the United States to do everything we can to help those two countries work together. We can't give them orders anymore, but we can do a lot to help bring them together and help to promote the kind of cooperation and decision-making at the very top level that's in all of our interests.
Thank you, Ezra.
John, thank you all very, very much. It's been a great discussion. Special thanks, Joe, to you and Ezra, and to everybody here, to our friends who participated. Just a personal comment. First, that we hope and expect to continue this discussion with at least a couple of additional conferences over the course of the year, and I hope we can do that. Secondly, interestingly enough, nobody mentioned the United Nations or its Secretary General, who happens to be a South Korean, and presumably knows something about this region as well. It seems to me that there's a lot to be said for a kind of broad internationalization of this in a way that just doesn't have three of these powers kind of spinning around trying to figure out what each is doing. In any event, John, thank you for another great job of moderating, and we look forward to joining with all of you in the course of the year and pursuing this discussion, and I hope coming up with some serious and important recommendations that will much improve the situation and build a strong foundation for the future. So thanks to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.